Weddings are meant to begin with music, flowers, and a promise. But sometimes, a celebration turns into a mystery. On a quiet London morning, inside a lavish dressing room, a wedding dress was found perfectly laid out, lace pristine, veil untouched, bouquet beside it. But the bride was nowhere to be found. No footsteps, no witnesses, just silence where joy should have been. Panic spread through the house, guests whispered. And that's when Sherlock Holmes was called to solve the puzzle of the wedding dress without a bride. Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, Holmes uncovers secrets buried beneath ribbons and lace, where love meets deception, and every thread hides a clue. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind this disappearance isn't just clever, it's devastating. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always exciting to see detectives from around the world join the investigation. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The impossible crime. Is with some hesitation that I commit this strange affair to paper, a case so baffling, so exquisitely peculiar in its contradictions, that even now I find myself doubting its occurrence, as though it were the stuff of dreams or opium-inspired phantasm. And yet, every detail remains etched in my memory, sharper even than those of the Afghan campaign or the most galling of surgeries. It began, as many curious matters have, on a fog-choked London morning. The bells of St. Marylebone struck 7 when the knock came at our Baker Street lodgings, sharp, urgent, and possessed of a tremor that betrayed distress. Holmes had been up since 5, pacing with violin in hand and muttering about the movements of tobacco ash, some private experiment. I dared not interrupt. Answer it. Watson, there's a tremor of grief in that knock, Holmes murmured, without turning. Still lost in the flickering shadows cast by our fireplace, I opened the door to admit a young constable, soaked to the bone and breathless from the climb. Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice cracking, Inspector Lestrade sent me. There's a matter, a delicate matter. At the Marylebone Registry. Registry, Holmes repeated, setting down the violin. Surely not a matter of civil paperwork gone awry. The constable hesitated. A wedding was to take place this morning. But when the chamber was opened, well, sir, there was no bride. Only the dress. Holmes raised an eyebrow, half amused. A jilted groom, perhaps. These are matters for gossip columns, not Scotland Yard. Not quite, sir. The dress was worn, arranged as though someone were standing in its arms. In the sleeves, veil draped, there was no body inside, no footprints, no sign of anyone ever entering or leaving. And ... he swallowed. The dress was stitched into itself, as though sealed shut from the inside. A long silence followed. Holmes blinked once, then turned to me. Fetch my coat, Watson. The Marylebone Registry office, a sturdy Georgian structure, had been sealed by the time we arrived. A trio of constables milled nervously outside as Inspector Lestrade stood at the door, arms crossed, mustache twitching with impatience. About time, he said, ushering us inside. The press'll have a field day if word gets out. The wedding chamber was an unassuming room, pale green walls, 2 chairs for witnesses, a central aisle, and a modest altar with a floral arrangement that now drooped from the mist leaking through a high window. But it was the dress that drew the Aja spectre of ivory and lace. There it stood, at the head of the aisle, a full bridal gown, suspended upright, as though inhabited by an invisible woman. The fabric clung to the form of arms, waist, and shoulders, too precisely to be explained by mere stuffing or support. The veil billowed faintly, though the windows were shut. Watson cleared his throat. Is it propped somehow from beneath? Lestrade shook his head. That's just it. We checked. No mannequin, no wires, nothing. And here's the kicker. Every seam is sewn tight. No way in, no way out. Who stitched it? When and how? ... We haven't a clue. Holmes circled the dress like a priest around a relic. His eyes flicked to the dais, to the carpet, the faint indentations beneath the fabric, the stitching of the hem. He dropped to his knees, running gloved fingers along the edge of the dress without touching it. Blood, he said at last. Where? Lestrade blinked. There. Along the stitching, a fine thread of it embedded in the seam. Not visible unless you catch the light. Watson leaned closer, squinting. Indeed, a glimmer of dark crimson barely marred the seam. Whisper of violence, hidden in elegance. Holmes turned suddenly to the bouquet on the altar. Whose flowers? Bride's, Lestrade answered. Ordered under the name Annabel Thorley, 26, seamstress, from Kent. Groom's, a merchant, George Eastmore. Holmes nodded absently, sniffing the flowers. Wolfsbane and Queen Anne's lace, curious for a bridal bouquet. One's mildly poisonous, the other symbolic of not love. Watson stepped forward. And the groom? Where is he? Collapsed shock. He's next door, under the watch of Nurse Hargrove. Keeps saying she was here. She was here. Won't say more. Chapter 2. A wedding without a bride. The cab ride back to Baker Street was a quiet one, save for the faint clatter of horse hooves and the sullen churn of the London fog outside our window. Holmes sat opposite me, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his eyes fixed not on the street, but some distant interior plane where logic reigned and sentiment held no dominion. I recognized the expression. It meant he had seen something none of us had. I confess, I ventured cautiously, that I cannot begin to imagine how such a deception was possible. The seams, the lack of entry, the blood. If Miss Thorley was ever inside that dress, how did she vanish without disturbing it? Holmes did not immediately answer. His gaze remained steady, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly, an unconscious drumbeat, as though in rhythm with some unseen truth struggling to emerge. We must never mistake the theatrical for the supernatural. Watson, he said at last, this is not the stuff of spirits or spectral vanity. It is the work of an intellect calculated, cold, and deeply peculiar. Then you believe it was staged? I believe it was performed, he said. And like any performance, its purpose is not simply to obscure, but to mislead. When we arrived at 2-1B, Holmes made no move toward his usual chair. Instead, he began pacing in front of the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. I retrieved my notebook, as I had countless times before, prepared to document his observations. Let us enumerate, he said briskly. Item 1. The dress arranged in such a way as to suggest presence, yet containing none. Item 2. The seams, hand-stitched shut with surgical precision. Item 3. The blood scares, but intentional. A symbol, not a mess. Item 4. The bokeh poisonous herbs, disguised in bridal innocence. And item 5. The chalk tailors, chalk blue-tinted, and left only in the corner furthest from the body. He paused, then spun on his heel to face me. Now tell me, Watson, what sort of woman chooses a symbol of death for her wedding bouquet? I blinked. One not intending to wed, perhaps. Holmes smiled faintly. Or one intending to make her absence a statement. You believe Miss Thorley vanished of her own accord, or someone made it appear as if she had, he replied. There's a difference. One is an act of escape, the other deliberate riddle. He crossed to his desk and began sorting through a series of newspaper clippings he had collected in recent weeks. Holmes' practice of scouring the society pages for seemingly irrelevant items had often struck me as frivolous till the moment they proved indispensable. Thorley, he murmured, thumbing through a stack. Annabel Thorley seamstress, yes, but also trained under Miss Eliza Merton's atelier in Chelsea. A respectable house known for its discreet clientele. I raised an eyebrow. You suspect a connection to one of her clients. I suspect a connection to someone who knew precisely how that dress was constructed, Holmes said. A seamstress might hide a message in thread, but one with access to society's secrets might stitch in something more dangerous. He finally selected a clipping and handed it to me. It was a modest announcement from the Daily Telegraph. Dated 3 weeks prior, engagement announced Mr. George Eastmore of Sussex Lane and Miss Annabel Thorley of Chelsea are pleased to announce their upcoming nuptials. No mention of family, I noted aloud. And the groom. Holmes straightened. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room where a small dusting of powder clung to the baseboards. He rubbed it between his fingers. Chalk, he muttered. Blue, likely marking powder. Tailor's work. Lestrade frowned. Then, perhaps, she was here. Changed into the gown, then disappeared. Impossible, Holmes said softly. The chamber was locked from the outside. No one entered after 6. And yet, he returned to the dress, circling it again, then tapping his fingers along the wall behind it. Watson, you see the faint groove here. Watson examined the paneling. A slight indentation ran vertically along the wood, near the edge of a column. A hidden door, he asked. Perhaps, Holmes replied. But more than that, I believe we are not merely facing a vanishing act. We are looking at a performance, a message. Watson glanced at the dress again, the stitched seams, the faint blood, the unnatural stillness of the air. You believe someone staged this? I believe, Holmes said slowly, someone went to extraordinary lengths to make a woman disappear without ever having to hide the body. We left the chamber in silence. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the windows like some sentient thing. Holmes stood for a long moment at the door before speaking. There are 5 inconsistencies in that room, he said, each one contradictory on its own, yet in combination they suggest something deliberate. Then you have a theory? Lestrade asked. Holmes didn't answer. He turned toward the waiting room where the groom sat hunched under a blanket. Not yet, he said. But I believe the answer lies not in the disappearance, but in the dress itself. Watson, I shall need your notes. This is not a crime of passion, it is one of precision. And with that, the game had begun. Holmes nodded. George Eastmore, merchant in mechanical parts, not wealthy, but far from poor, suffered a bankruptcy 5 years ago, paid off all debts in cash, Holmes said. An unusual feat. Now, consider what if Eastmore's engagement was not one of romance, but of necessity. What if Miss Thorley was not a bride, but a pawn? I frowned. A pawn in what sort of game? Holmes tapped the edge of the clipping. That, Watson, is what we must discover. Just then, the bell rang below. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the sitting-room door. A card on her tray. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." Holmes took the card, read it silently, and his eyebrows lifted a fraction. "Ah," he murmured, "the bridegroom returns." Mr. George Eastmore entered looking like a man recently exhumed. His complexion was waxen, and his collar hung loose around a neck that seemed incapable of supporting his head. His hands trembled visibly as he accepted the glass of brandy Holmes offered. I don't know what's happening," he stammered. "One moment she was to marry me, the next gone. Not run away. Not kidnapped, gone." Holmes studied him carefully. "Tell me, Mr. Eastmore, did Miss Thorley ever express misgivings about the marriage?" "No, never," he said quickly. She was happy, I thought. We argued once or twice, but nothing unusual. She was secretive, perhaps, but who isn't these days? Secretive in what way? Eastmore's eyes dropped. She kept a locked drawer in her flat, never opened it while I was there, claimed it was personal. Holmes made a soft noise. "Did she work on her own gown?" "Yes," Eastmore nodded. "She insisted. Said she wouldn't trust anyone else." Holmes' voice dropped. "Then tell me, Mr. Eastmore, how long ago did you last see Annabel Thorley?" The man hesitated, lips parting, but no words emerged. I don't know," he finally admitted. "I thought I saw her enter the chamber, but perhaps I only wanted to." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The fog outside had begun to thicken once more, pressing against the panes like a gathering storm. "I shall need access to Miss Thorley's rooms," Holmes said briskly, "and you will remain available, Mr. Eastmore, until I say otherwise." Eastmore only nodded, stunned. As the door closed behind him, Holmes stood silently for a long moment, then turned back to me. "She made the dress herself," he murmured. "She stitched it shut. She bled into it, and yet no one saw her leave. Then she never did." Holmes gave a rare shiver, or she never meant to. Chapter 3. The scene of deception knit was late afternoon when we arrived at Miss Annabel Thorley's lodgings on the eastern edge of Chelsea. The building, a narrow townhouse pressed between a tobacconist and a dismal-looking butcher's, seemed unassuming at first glance, yet something about it unsettled me. The windows were tightly shuttered, the curtains drawn, as though hiding more than just the meager comforts within. The landlady, a stiff-jawed woman named Mrs. Ellingham, met us at the door with a sour face and a kerchief tied tight under her chin. She had the air of someone determined not to be impressed, least of all by Sherlock Holmes. "I told the police already," she sniffed. Miss Thorley was a quiet girl, paid her rent, came and went at proper hours, kept to herself. If you ask me, she's had some kind of breakdown. Artists always do. She was a seamstress, not a painter, I interjected. Mrs. Ellingham sniffed again. All the same to me, Doctor. Holmes offered no comment. He was already halfway up the stairs. Annabel Thorley's room was on the second floor. It was modest, but meticulously kept a writing desk beside the window, a single bed tucked neatly against the far wall, and a dressmaker's form standing in the corner, draped with muslin. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and starch. Holmes stood motionless just inside the doorway, eyes scanning every object in the room with surgical intensity. I waited, knowing better than to interrupt. He moved first to the writing desk. Drawers slid open, one by one, stationary blank envelopes, spools of thread. He held up a sheet of paper to the light, unwritten, but the pressure marks of a previous note remain. He murmured, "Watson, your pencil, if you please." I handed it over, and he shaded the paper delicately. Letters began to emerge from the indentations. "You have no right to threaten me. I'll do it on my terms. You'll regret pressing me further." He held it up for a moment, then folded it carefully into his coat. "Addressed to whom, I wonder?" I said. "The groom, possibly," Holmes replied, "or someone else entirely." He crossed the room and examined the seamstress's mannequin. Pins were still stuck in its muslin overlay, but beneath it the form itself had been carved not quite as one would expect. The bust and shoulders were narrower than usual, and the waist alarmingly thin. Holmes tapped its base. Hollow, modified. This wasn't simply a model, it was used for concealment. He flipped the muslin aside to reveal a narrow seam at the base. With a click, the bottom half split open like a cabinet. Inside, neatly folded, were 3 long swaths of ivory fabric and a second bridal veil. There were 2 gowns, I said. Holmes nodded. Or one was never worn at all. This one's unfinished. See the hem. Still basted. At that moment, something caught my eye near the bed, a small, battered jewelry box, half tucked beneath it. I crouched and retrieved it. "Locked," I said. "Try the thread scissors," Holmes offered without turning. I did. With some careful maneuvering, the narrow blade fit the latch, and it popped open. Inside were several trinkets, an old brooch, a hairpin, and a folded envelope sealed with red wax. It bore no name. Holmes took the envelope delicately and held it to the light. A faint watermark crossed daggers, peered. "I've seen this before. Not in correspondence, but in tattooing. Certain underworld circles, practitioners of quiet extortion, operating beneath the guise of employment. Our Miss Thorley may have been under threat." I frowned. Then this was not simply a bride running away. "Not merely," Holmes said. "It may have been a prison break of sorts." He turned to the wardrobe and flung it open. Dresses hung neatly on padded hangers, muted tones, practical cuts. But one stood out, a rich, velvet gown in deep green, elegant, expensive, and unmistakably not made by the same hand. Holmes studied stitching. "Not her work," he murmured, "nor her style. Look here, Watson. See the inside pocket, a label." He drew it out. "Hallgrave and Sons, Custom Tailors, Hanover Street." "A man's tailor," I said. Holmes nodded. "Which makes this dress either borrowed or planted." He knelt and inspected the floorboards beneath the wardrobe, running his fingers along the edges until click. A loose plank lifted easily. Within, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a thin volume, The Brides of the Abyss by Edwin Clark. "Never heard of it," I said. "Because it doesn't exist," Holmes replied. "Fake cover." hollowed out. He opened it to reveal a photograph, grainy, poorly lit. A man and woman in a tailor's shop, shaking hands. The woman was Thorley. The man, not Eastmore Holmes, stared at the image for several seconds, then turned to me. "We must visit this Holgrave's tailor shop at once. I believe we are being shown a false groom and, perhaps, a very real enemy." Back in the hallway, Mrs. Ellingham waited with folded arms. "You find what you were looking for?" she asked stiffly. "More than I expected," Holmes replied without emotion. The landlady hesitated. "There was a gentleman who came by 2 nights ago, asked after Miss Thorley. Said he was her uncle. I'd never seen him before." "Did he give a name?" I asked. "No, but he left a calling card." She handed Holmes a square of heavy stock, no name, only the outline of a dagger, embossed in silver. Holmes turned it over in silence. "A performance, indeed," he said. "But now I believe I've caught sight of the theater's architect." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. We arrived at Holgrave and Sons under a dismal sky. The rain had begun again, tapping against the cobbles of Hanover Street with a dreary persistence. The shop front, however, stood pristine, windows polished, mannequins sharply dressed, and a brass sign gleaming with understated affluence. Holmes paused before entering, taking a moment to observe the 2 carriages parked across the street, a newsboy loitering under the awning, and an older woman sweeping the steps of the milliner's next door. "Someone is watching," Holmes muttered, almost absently. "Let us be dull and pedestrian, Watson. It may encourage them to underestimate us." We stepped inside. The interior of Holgrave and Sons was everything one might expect from a tailor catering to London's discreet elite. Dark oak panels, Persian carpets, and gas lamps that glowed with restrained warmth. Behind the counter stood a tall, pale man with a measuring tape draped around his neck and a scar that curved like a quill from his left eye to his jaw. "You are Mr. Holgrave?" Holmes asked. The man looked up slowly. His eyes were a piercing steel gray, but his voice was calm. "Mr. Elias Holgrave, yes. How may I assist you, gentlemen?" Holmes handed him the photograph recovered from Miss Thorley's hidden floorboard. Holgrave studied it, his expression unreadable. "Do you recognize this woman?" He returned the photo. "No, sir. Though the gentleman, yes. That is Mr. Lionel Shefford, a loyal customer, recently fitted for evening wear." "Would you be so kind as to confirm his address?" Holmes asked. "I'm afraid our clientele expect discretion," Holgrave replied coolly. "And I," Holmes cut him off with a single glance. "Shefford is connected to a missing woman and a criminal investigation. You will provide the address, or I shall take it to the Commissioner of Police." A pause. Then, slowly, Holgrave opened his ledger. "Shefford maintains 2 residences," he said. "One in Bloomsbury, the other, less formal, a private club, the Briar's Nest, down by Limehouse Docks." Holmes pocketed the note. "You've been most helpful." As we turned to go, Holgrave added, "For what it's worth, Mr. Holmes, I didn't much like him. A man who smiles with his mouth, but never with his eyes." Back at Baker Street, Holmes had begun sketching connections across a map of London. Threads ran from Marylebone to Chelsea, from Holgrave's shop to the docks. Each pin marked not just a location, but a possibility. "I believe the time has come to identify our players," he said. "Watson, take this down. I opened my notebook. Player 1, George Eastmore. The groom. Either genuinely ignorant or a very poor actor. His panic reads as sincere, yet his history of sudden wealth casts a long shadow. Player 2, Lionel Shefford. A wealthy man with access to both a private club and a tailor skilled in bespoke deception. Appears in a photograph with Annabelle, though pretends no involvement. Player 3, Annabelle Thorley herself. Seamstress, possible victim, possible architect. Left a message implying blackmail. Created a dress that was more prison than garment. Player 4, the man with the dagger card. Unknown identity. Claims kinship. Possibly an agent of coercion. Holmes tapped the photo again. If Shefford is the spider at the center, then Annabelle was either the fly or something far more dangerous. At that moment, there came a knock at the door. It was Inspector Lestrade, looking uncharacteristically grave. "We've had a development," he said, stepping inside and shaking rain from his coat. A woman unconscious was found near Limhouse. Veil torn, hands bloodied. No identification, but a label from Merton's atelier sewn into the inside of her corset. "Annabelle?" I asked. Lestrade hesitated. "Too early to say. The face is bruised. Likely beaten. She's at St. Bartholomew's, under guard." Holmes rose instantly. "Then we go now." At the hospital, the woman lay beneath starched sheets in a private room, her face partially bandaged. A nurse stood beside her, adjusting an ether drip. Holmes examined her silently, eyes darting between her features and the bruises. "Do we have a time of discovery?" he asked. "About 4 hours ago," Lestrade replied. "A dock worker found her behind a crate near Pier 17. It looked like someone meant to toss her into the Thames and thought better of it." "She's not Annabelle," Holmes said at last. Lestrade blinked. "You're sure?" "I've studied her photograph," Holmes replied. "This woman is of a similar build, similar complexion, but there are subtle differences. Annabelle has a scar on her left collarbone, shaped like a crescent. This woman does not. Then who is she?" Holmes turned to the nurse. "When she wakes, keep her under constant watch. Do not let anyone in without my approval." "Understood." The nurse nodded, pale as we left the hospital. Holmes lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "She's a stand-in," he said. "A decoy. Someone meant for us to find. Then the real Annabelle is either in hiding," he said grimly, "or she's in deeper trouble than we imagined." By the time we returned to Baker Street, night had fallen. The fog had thickened to a choking blanket, muffling sound and distorting the lamps to eerie halos. He scribbled notes, paced, and read old criminal records from a dusty box under his desk. "Shefford," he muttered. "Shefford is the key. We must see him next." "And the others?" I asked. "We'll call them together soon," Holmes replied. "When the stage is ready. For now, let them believe the deception is working." He looked up at me then, eyes gleaming. "This case isn't about a disappearance, Watson. It's about control of identity, of fear, and of the story itself." I closed my notebook, and in that moment, I began to wonder if we were chasing a missing bride, or an illusion so convincing that even she might have believed it. Chapter 5. The man in the garden. Detective Blaze stood near the stone fountain in the overgrown garden. His eyes narrowed as he examined the worn path where Madame Vauquelin claimed she had seen a man watching her. Weeds had grown tall, brushing his coat as he moved carefully, avoiding the slick moss clinging to the flagstones. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, and the sun, though bright, cast long and ambiguous shadows through the bare trees, too recent to be completely overgrown, Blaise muttered, kneeling beside a faint imprint in the muddy soil. It looked like a shoe print, narrow, likely a man's, leading deeper into the garden before vanishing into the underbrush. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small ruler and notepad, noting the approximate length and angle of the sole. No treads possibly, a dress shoe. He straightened up just as Darnell stepped through the side gate, carrying a folded map of the estate. No gardener in 6 months, Darnell announced. Madame Vauquelin let the place go wild after her husband died. Even the neighbors stopped visiting. Says she preferred the silence. Blaise gave a curt nod. Silence, and someone watching her from the garden. Darnell looked toward the thicket of brambles at the edge. If someone's been out here recently, they'd need to know where not to step. You can twist an ankle fast in this muck. Locals say this place gives them the chills, haunted widows and all. Blaise tucked the notepad back in his coat. Let's check the perimeter. I want to see where this man would have entered or exited without drawing attention. They followed the outer path, their boots crunching over frostbitten grass and dead leaves. Near the back hedge, Blaise spotted another cinnabroken branch, freshly snapped, and an old cigarette butt mashed into the soil. He lifted it with tweezers, sniffed lightly, and grimaced. Galouses, French tobacco. Expensive taste. Darnell raised an eyebrow. Madame Vauquelin smoked those. She doesn't smoke at all. The two detectives exchanged a look. This wasn't just paranoia on her part. Someone had definitely been lingering here. And not just once. This was a habitual pattern, back inside the manor. Madame Vauquelin waited in the drawing room, seated stiffly on the edge of a velvet settee. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, white-knuckled, as if suppressing a constant tremor. Blaise approached gently. Madame, have you ever noticed anything missing from the house? Items moved, doors unlocked, that sort of thing. She nodded slowly. Yes, a few times. Drawers left open. One of Lucien's old pipes vanished, then reappeared on the windowsill 2 days later. Darnell scribbled in his notebook. Did you mention this to anyone else before us? Her brow furrowed. Only to my sister, but she dismissed it. Said it was grief playing tricks on me. And the man you saw, would you recognize him again? She hesitated, then stood and walked to a cabinet tucked in the corner. From a drawer, she pulled out a small charcoal sketch, clearly done with an unsteady hand, but the man's angular jaw and deep-set eyes were discernible. His expression was vague, but his silhouette was haunting. Blaise examined the drawing carefully. Did your husband know this man? She blinked. I think so, but I never met him. Lucien used to receive letters, handwritten, with no return address. Sometimes he burned them without opening them. Once, I caught a glimpse of one before he destroyed it. There was a name. I think it was Emile. Darnell leaned in. Emile, first or last name? I don't know. Lucien never spoke of him, but there was tension. After those letters came, he'd retreat to his study and stay there for hours. Blaise paced slowly. Do you still have any of those letters? She shook her head. He was careful, paranoid even. Burned everything. Blaise turned back to her. And after his death, did you receive anything strange? Messages, calls, visitors? she swallowed. Yes, a few weeks ago. I found a note slipped under the back door. It said, "You don't know what he took from me. I'll take it back, one way or another." Darnell's pen paused. "Do you still have that note?" She nodded, her face pale. She retrieved it from a box beneath the piano, unfolding the single piece of cream-colored stationery. The writing was elegant, precise, almost beautiful, and chilling. Blaze held it up to the light. "Ink hasn't faded much. This is recent. Whoever wrote this still believes there's something worth taking." Darnell gestured toward the stairs. "Should we go through Lucien's study?" "Yes," Blaze said. "Madame, would you show us the way?" She led them up the staircase and into a high-ceilinged room lined with dark bookshelves. The curtains were pulled tight, but even in dim light, the dust in the air glinted. On the desk sat an old typewriter, a sealed ink bottle, and a ledger with thin black lettering. Blaze approached the desk and pulled the ledger closer. It was a record of Lucien's final week's expenses, business correspondences, and curious entries marked only with the initials ERBLAZE tapped the page. "Do you recognize these initials?" Madame Vauquelin stared at them, face blank. "No, they don't mean anything to me." But Blaze wasn't convinced. He could see it's something flickered across her expression before she turned away. A recognition, or perhaps a memory she wished to bury. He exchanged a look with Darnell, the garden stalker, the missing pipe, the anonymous notes, the hidden initials in Lucien's private ledger. This was no ordinary case of a grieving widow and a shadow in the garden. Something darker simmered beneath the surface, a past entangled in secrecy, and Blaze had the distinct sense that the late Lucien Vauquelin had died not from illness or accident, but from a secret coming home to roost. Chapter 6. The night the locket opened, rain lashed, a small, gilded locket turning between his fingers. It had been found wedged behind the bookshelf in Miriam's chamber, an object so delicately crafted that it might have been dismissed as a sentimental trinket. But Blaze knew better. Sentiment, in matters of murder, often masked motives. Lady Halbrook paced the rug, arms crossed tightly. "That belonged to my late husband's sister, Isabella. She died when I was still newly married." "Why was it in Miriam's room?" Blaze looked up slowly. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Her lips thinned. "I have no idea. Isabella's belongings were divided and stored. That locket should have been in the attic with the rest." Blaze didn't reply immediately. Instead, he snapped open the locket. Inside was a faded miniature of two girls, Isabella and Lady Halbrook, in their youth. Opposite the portrait was a tiny, folded note. With gloved fingers, he slid it free and unfolded it. The script was fragile, almost trembling. "He knows about the blood. If I vanish, it won't be suicide." Blaze, read it aloud. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the fire's hiss and pop. Lady Halbrook sat down slowly. "Who could have written that?" she whispered. "Isabella. Or someone close to her," Blaze murmured. What blood was she referring to? And who is he? Lady Halbrook buried her face in her hands. She was frightened near the end. She used to talk about being watched, about someone following her in the woods. Blaze frowned. Did anyone believe her? "My husband didn't, called it hysteria. I wasn't sure." She was prone to moods, but "I did see someone lurking near the stables once. She screamed when I mentioned it." "Did your husband ever speak of her death?" "Only that she fell from the cliffs." There was no investigation. It was too painful to discuss. Blaise tucked the note into a wax envelope. I believe this locket was planted in Miriam's room. But why? Because someone wanted us to find it, Nous. Someone who knows the past is creeping into the present. He left Lady Halbrook, pale and shaken. Outside, Constable Wren met him in the corridor. The stable hand finally returned, said he found something by the north woods. Blaise followed Wren through the soaked grounds until they reached a narrow, overgrown trail at the estate's edge. The stable hand, a wiry youth with nervous eyes, pointed to a cluster of disturbed earth near the roots of a gnarled tree. There I thought it might be animal digging. But then I saw this. He handed Blaise a rusted tin box. Blaise pried it open with his penknife. Inside were yellowed letters, tied with a velvet ribbon. The topmost was addressed to my dearest Miriam. He unfolded it carefully and read, "If he finds out we've written to each other again, he'll lose what's left of his mind. I beg Ubernice." After reading, I couldn't bear him finding them. The handwriting didn't match Isabella's. This was Miriam's. Blaise recognized the distinct slant from her diary. She was communicating with someone, he said slowly. Someone she feared. Possibly the same he from the locket note. He scanned the rest of the letters. Most were mundane musings about the garden, longing to escape the manor, complaints about unseen eyes in the halls. But one stood out. It was short, written in shaking lines. He said what happened to Isabella would happen to me if I didn't stop. He called her weak-blooded. He says I'm stronger, but I'm scared, even now. Blaise stared into the mist drifting between the trees. This isn't just about jealousy or inheritance. This is generational fear, circling like a predator. That night, as the house quieted under a hush of storm winds, Blaise sat in the study, letters and photographs spread before him. Something in the photo from Isabella's locket caught his eye. He held it under the lamplight. Behind the two girls, barely visible, was a shadowy figure near the hedge. He took out a magnifier. A man stood at a distance, half turned, face obscured. But his posture was unmistakable, angular, with a slight forward stoop. Blaise had seen that stance earlier in the hallway portraits. He rose, stepping over to the portrait of Baron Edmund Halbrook. The same shoulders, the same posture. He returned to the desk, more focused now. There had been no mention of Isabella's death being suspicious. But what if it had been silenced deliberately? And what if the same threat had hung over Miriam, driving her into secrecy? Suddenly, there was a knock. Wren entered. "You should see this, sir." In his hand was a fresh note, written in careful block letters. "Stop digging, or someone else will vanish." It had slipped under Blaise's door. He looked up, face unreadable. "We're getting close." And in the silence that followed, even the fire dared not crackle. Chapter 7. The Candle Behind the Clock. The following morning, Poirot rose with the meticulous calm of a man who believed breakfast deserved both silence and symmetry. Hastings, already halfway through his toast and marmalade, glanced up expectantly as Poirot emerged from his room at Mrs. Farnham's inn, his suit impeccable, his mustache neatly waxed. "You didn't sleep much," Hastings remarked. "Mon ami Poirot," said, pouring himself tea. "But the little gray cells, they have been at work." Before Hastings could inquire further, Mrs. Farnham herself entered, clutching a bundle of fresh linens. She paused, seemingly unsure whether to speak, but Poirot noticed her pallor. "Madame," he said gently, "vous avez-vous quelque chose?" "I know, Monsieur Poirot, just ... that I had a dream about Eliza." Her voice trembled. She was holding a candle and pointing behind the grandfather clock. "Silly, isn't it?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, ever so slightly. "Dreams, madam, are often the fragments of memory we dare not face in daylight. Tell me this grandfather clock. Is it still in the lounge?" "Yes, sir." "Hasn't worked in years." Poirot rose. "Come, Hastings. Let us indulge this dream." They stepped into the wood-paneled lounge, where the antique grandfather clock stood against the far wall, partially hidden by a faded velvet drape. Poirot approached it like one might approach a reluctant witness, gently but with purpose. He knelt and carefully removed the clock's front panel. Inside, all appeared undisturbed: rusted gears, dusty weights, a spider spinning its indifferent web. But Poirot tilted his head, eyes drawn to the backboard. Something was there. With a gloved hand, he reached in and pulled out a short, half-burned candle stub, its wax warped unnaturally to one side, as if it had melted, lying on something uneven. "A candle, Hastings," he said softly, "exactly as in Mrs. Farnham's dream." "But what does it mean?" Hastings asked, puzzled. "People light candles all the time." "Yes, but not behind clocks, mon ami, and not during a house party already lit by electric fixtures." Poirot turned the candle slowly. "Unless it was to provide a hidden light, a clandestine meeting, perhaps, or a signal." He slipped the candle into a small evidence pouch. "Tell me, Hastings, do you recall where Lady Vale said she had found Eliza's scarf?" "In the drawing-room, near the fireplace," Hastings replied. "Let us go there. I have a feeling something was staged." Once in the drawing-room, Poirot studied the room in silence. The hearth was spotless, now scrubbed to clean. Above it, a mirror hung slightly askew. Poirot adjusted it carefully, then stepped back. "Observe the line of sight," he said. "If one sat here." He pulled a chair forward and placed a candle behind the grandfather clock across the hall. The flame would reflect faintly in the mirror. "A silent message, you mean?" "Someone was using the reflection to signal. Perhaps, or perhaps the reflection was meant to be seen by only one person, someone who knew the code." They returned to the hallway just as the butler, Hawthorne, passed by. Poirot stopped him. "Forgive me, monsieur, but were any matches found in the lounge?" "No, sir, none that I know of." Poirot nodded slowly. "And who cleaned the lounge the morning after the storm?" "I believe it was Greta, sir." "The maid, Mercy, back in their room." Hastings looked troubled. "So you believe Eliza was lured to that room, using the candle as a signal?" "Possibly. Or she left a signal for someone else. The question is, who understood it?" There was a knock at the door. Greta, the maid, peeked in nervously. "Sir, you asked me to come." "Oui, mademoiselle. Please, have a seat." "You cleaned the lounge, did you not?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see this candle before today?" Her eyes widened. "No, sir. I only found a bit of wax. I thought it was just from the wax seal on the wine bottle we opened that night." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Wine seal wax and candle wax, they are not the same." He paused. "Tell me, Greta, anyone ask you to remove or dispose of anything. A candle, perhaps. She hesitated. Lady Vale said to be thorough, that the guests might be upset by reminders of. Well, Miss Eliza, she didn't say anything directly, though. Poirot nodded, dismissing her gently. As the door closed, he turned to Hastings. Lady Vale's subtle instructions, they are becoming rather suspect. She was present when Eliza was last seen, and she may have tried to erase this signal. She could have found the candle and hidden it, Hastings said. But why? Guilt, or something more intricate? Just then, a carriage was heard outside, followed by the sound of crisp shoes on gravel. A constable entered the foyer and handed Poirot a sealed note. Poirot opened it and read silently. Then his eyes narrowed. "Ah," he murmured. "The background check I requested. Hastings, did you know Eliza's brother, Mr. Dean Everley, was once arrested in Vienna, caught trespassing in a closed estate? He claimed he was searching for a hidden message left by their father." Hastings blinked. A message. We, the Everleys, it seems, have a long tradition of leaving coded letters and puzzles. Their father fancied himself a romantic cryptologist. You think Eliza was trying to uncover something left behind, or someone else believed she had? Poirot stood. The signal behind the clock, the scrubbed fireplace, a family obsessed with riddles. Hastings, this mystery is more than a simple murder. It is a hunt, and we are not the only hunters. He adjusted his cufflinks. Tomorrow we will speak with Dean Everley, and we examine the estate's blueprints, especially the drawing room and the clock alcove, because I suspect we are standing atop a message hidden in plain sight, and someone was willing to kill to keep it that way. Chapter 8. The Widow's Unforgiven Pasta. Candles in the drawing room flickered gently as the wind rattled the windows like impatient fingers. Poirot leaned forward in his seat, his eyes locked on the widow, Madame Renata Weiss, whose carefully constructed poise was beginning to fray at the edges. "You will forgive me," Madame Poirot said softly, "but your account of that night, it does not satisfy." Renata's lips twitched. "I don't know what you mean." "I believe you do," he said, steepling his fingers. "It was not the mirror that was cracked, but the story itself." She stood from the settee. "I have nothing more to say to you, Monsieur Poirot, but I have more to say to you," he replied calmly. "Do sit." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, perhaps from exhaustion or resignation, Renata sat again. Poirot opened his notebook. "Let us discuss the contents of your late husband's study. There was a safe." Yes," she replied slowly, "but it was always locked. Always." "Are you certain?" Poirot tilted his head. "Then how do you explain the missing documents, the burnt fragments?" Her eyes flickered with something panic. I don't know." Poirot leaned back, folding his arms. "You see, Madame, your husband was keeping more than war medals in that room. A letter was retrieved from the fireplace, partly destroyed. It bore your name." Renata paled. "A letter? From whom?" "That is what I intend to find out. But the handwriting, though mostly gone, bore a resemblance to someone quite close to this house." She looked away. Poirot continued. "Let me hazard a guess, Madame. Before your husband died, he confronted you with something a secret, long buried, something connected to the man who once visited this estate years ago, a man who never returned." Renata's breath caught. "You don't know what you're talking about, but I do." Poirot's voice dropped. "His name was Emile Gruber." a family friend, an old soldier, a widower like yourself. You were once lovers." She stiffened. Poirot didn't wait. In 1918, he vanished after a short visit to this estate. He was last seen entering the orchard at dusk. There were whispers, but no charges, and yet your husband kept an oil portrait of Emile in the attic, buried beneath a sheet, as if he could not destroy it. Renata's silence was heavier than words. Poirot rose and walked to the fireplace. He knew, he always knew. Renata finally broke. Her voice was thin. He knew, but he never said it out loud. Not once. He drank instead. And when the drinking became rage, I let him fall into his own poison. Poirot turned. "Are you saying you did not kill him but let him kill himself?" A tear slipped down her cheek. He locked himself in that study with the bottle. The same bottle he told me Emile had gifted him before the war. I knew what was in it. I heard the cork. I saw the flames in the grate. I knew what he was planning, and I walked away. Poirot was quiet for a long time. "Madame, that is not murder, but it is not innocence either." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Inspector Ludden entered, holding a yellowed envelope found in the chimney flue. He said, handing it to Poirot. Poirot opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased, but unmistakable. Renata and Emile in the orchard, laughing. Behind them, barely visible, stood her husband, watching. Poirot handed it to her. She stared at the image as if it might burn her. "You see, madame," he said gently, "truth has a habit of remaining long after the lies have turned to ash." Renata didn't look up. "What will you do?" Poirot was silent for a moment, then turned to Ludden. "I believe we must speak with the coroner again. The official cause may be suicide, but what led him there deserves illumination." Ludden nodded grimly. "We'll reopen the inquiry." Renata's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph. "He never forgave me, I think. I never forgave myself." Poirot's gaze softened. "That is the cruelest punishment of all." He walked toward the door, but paused before exiting. "One last thing, madame. The white dress. Why did you wear it that night?" She looked up, haunted. "Because it was what I wore the day Emile died. My husband asked me to wear it again, I think. He wanted to see me as I was when I betrayed him." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Then that explains the midnight ghost." As he stepped into the corridor, the house behind him felt older, somehow like a memory that had finally exhaled. Chapter 9. The Confession in the Corridor. The candlelight flickered as the long hallway of the Sneeze house stretched before Blaise and Mrs. Hemsworth, who, despite her fragile composure, walked with the strength of someone long burdened by secrets. Her hand, still gripping the edge of her shawl, trembled as she halted just outside the library. "I wasn't always a widow, detective," she said, turning to Blaise, "and Harold Beckwith wasn't always just a family friend." Blaise leaned against the paneled wall, arms folded, letting the silence coax her to speak. "It began in 24, she continued, eyes on the rug, voice hollow. "My husband, Arthur, had returned from the war, a different man, paranoid, prone to bursts of anger. We all said he was ill, but there was something darker. Harold, ... He was the only one who saw it clearly." "You and Harold were close," Blaise said quietly. She gave a single nod. "Not as lovers, no." But there was an intimacy, a deep understanding. One night, he came to me, shaken. He told me he'd found Arthur standing over the sleeping child with a knife. Blaise raised his brow. Our son. Arthur never remembered the moment. But Harold insisted it wasn't a dream. After that, things became strained. I began locking the nursery door at night. We all pretended things were normal, but they weren't, Blaise murmured. Double quotes, no. And then, one day, Arthur disappeared. The police believed he drowned. The lake, you know. But no body was found. And Harold, he stayed to help. He took over the estate's management. For years we said nothing to each other about what had happened. But I think it haunted him. Blaise rubbed his jaw, the wheels in his mind turning. Mrs. Hemsworth, when did Harold begin collecting the records? She hesitated. About a year ago. Around the time I began seeing someone lurking on the grounds at night. I thought I imagined it, grief, playing tricks. But Harold was convinced someone was watching us. Blaise's mind reeled. And the music box in room 9. That was Arthur's, she whispered. A gift from his father. It hadn't played since he died. Yet last month, it started again. On its own. Every third night, at midnight. Harold swore it was a warning. Blaise exhaled slowly. You're telling me Harold believed someone in this house was trying to send a message? About Arthur? I don't know. But he started writing down everything. Guests, their backgrounds, their habits. He had a ledger. It's missing now. Someone took it after the murder. Or Harold hid it before he died, she said softly. A door creaked behind them, footsteps. It was Camilla, cheeks flushed, her expression drawn. I need to speak with you both, she said breathlessly. It's about the photograph Harold found in the drawer. Mrs. Hemsworth stiffened. He showed it to me, Camilla continued. It was taken the week Arthur disappeared. A group photo guests, staff. Harold had circled 2 faces. Blaise's eyes sharpened. Who? Camilla swallowed. One was himself. The other was Dr. Lyle Guitarage. Mrs. Hemsworth gasped. That's impossible. Lyle wasn't here that year. That's what he claimed, Camilla replied. But the photo proves otherwise. Blaise stood upright. Then he lied. The question is why. I think Harold discovered he had returned to the estate secretly, Camilla said. And whatever happened the night Arthur vanished, Harold believed Lyle was involved. Mrs. Hemsworth gripped the edge of the wall. That would explain why Harold grew so distant. Why he feared someone in the house. Blaise nodded. And now Harold is dead, and Lyle conveniently claims ignorance. Camilla hesitated. There's more. The old gardener Meister Sneed, he was the one who developed Harold's photo. He says there was another print, a second copy that Harold insisted he hide. In the bell tower, she said, behind the old service board. Without a word, Blaise turned. We're going there, now. As they moved toward the service stairwell, Blaise's thoughts spiraled. The bell tower hadn't been used in decades. If Harold had hidden a second copy, he knew the original would be destroyed or stolen. And Harold was too careful. He wanted someone to find it after his death. As they ascended the narrow stairs, the air grew colder. Dust clung to the wooden beams and long-forgotten brass pulleys that once rang the house's warning bells. Mrs. Hemsworth stayed below, while Camilla followed close behind at the top. Blaise found the service board, its levers rusted, its names faded. He pried at the wooden panel behind it. The wood groaned then, a hollow space. A small metal box nestled inside. He lifted it, undid the latch, and inside a photograph. Yellowed, curled at the edges. 7 people, standing outside the sneeze house, encircled in ink, Harold Beckwith and Dr. Lyle Gateridge. The date in the corner, August 4th, 1924. Well, well, Blaze muttered. Gateridge, lead. And Harold knew it. Camilla shivered beside him. But why would Lyle lie about being here that summer? Because whatever happened to Arthur, he may have had a hand in it. The photo trembled in Blaze's fingers as the weight of revelation pressed on him. But something gnawed at him deeper, the arrangement of the people in the photo, their expressions, the empty space between Harold and Lyle. Camilla, he said, voice low, do you see that? The shadow in the window behind them. She leaned closer. It's a face. Yes, Blaze said grimly. And it's not any of the people in the photo. A silent pause. You think Harold knew who that was? I think Harold knew too much, Blaze replied. And someone made sure he stayed quiet forever. He turned, the picture still in hand, already feeling the tremors of the truth building toward the edge. Chapter 10. A whisper in the vault. The air inside the town archive was stale and heavy, the scent of old paper clinging to the stone walls like a shroud. Detective Blaze stood beneath the dim flicker of a gas lantern, watching as the archivist unlocked a thick wooden door leading to the vault. The room had not been accessed in years, perhaps even a decade. It was precisely the kind of place where secrets preferred to sleep, undisturbed by the living. Blaze's fingers grazed the edge of his jacket, as if seeking comfort from the cold iron grip of his revolver habit, not intent. Beside him, Amelia carried a thick notepad, her eyes alert and keen despite the hour. You're sure the widow's estate papers would be stored here? Blaze asked the archivist. The man nodded nervously. Records show a sealed ledger marked with her husband's name was deposited by their solicitor after his death. We've had no cause to retrieve it since. They stepped inside. Rows of heavy shelves loomed like sentinels, stretching toward a vaulted ceiling, casting long shadows in the lantern's sway. The silence inside was near perfect only. The crackle of Blaze's boots and the occasional rustle of Amelia's skirt disturbed it. The archivist led them to a far corner where the oldest deposits were kept. Pulling a worn drawer labeled Wilhelmine 98, Estate and Correspondence, a thick volume bound in dark green leather emerged, its brass corners dulled with time. He handed it to Blaze and stepped back respectfully. Blaze opened the ledger carefully. Inside were property deeds, lists of debts cleared posthumously, and something more curious, a handwritten addendum tucked into a faded envelope. On the front, scrawled in rushed ink, was a date, July 9th, 1901, the day before Wilhelm supposedly fell to his death. He unfolded the paper. The ink had faded, but the message was sharp and precise. If anything happens to me before the wedding, do not trust the will. Someone is maneuvering, and it is not who you think. No signature, no recipient, just a desperate warning on the eve of death. Amelia leaned over, her brow furrowed. The wedding, he meant the widow's remarriage to Jasper Bell. Blaze nodded. It's the only marriage planned after Wilhelm's death, unless she was meant to marry someone else. Either way, This note was meant to alert someone. But who? He turned the envelope over. Inside, almost invisible in the seam, was a second slip of paper thin and dry as onion skin. Blaze gently teased it out and laid it flat. Check the vault's southern floor. Beneath the false stone, a ledger was hidden. I saw him. The room grew colder. Blaze looked up. Is this where the real bookkeeping was kept? Not the clean estate documents. The archivist blinked. That section was sealed decades ago. We've had no requests to search it. They moved together toward the southern wing of the vault, farther than even the archivist seemed comfortable with. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and mold crept up from the foundation. Here, the stones beneath their feet felt uneven, some loose, some chipped. Blaze stopped and crouched, running his fingers along the ground. One stone near the wall was lighter than the others, its fit less secure. Using a flat tool from his coat, he pried at the edges. The slab shifted with a grating sound, revealing a hollow pocket beneath. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, slick with time. He pulled it free and peeled the cloth back to reveal a second ledger, this one bound in red leather. The initials W.H. stamped in gold. He opened it. Here was the rot, falsified transactions, altered numbers, payments to unfamiliar names, most notably one signed J.B. over and over again. Jasper Belford had been siphoning money from Wilhelm long before the man died. There's more, Amelia said, flipping through the latter half of the book. Look, withdrawals made after Wilhelm's death. Forged signatures. Even bribes listed to the local magistrate and the widow's own physician. Blaze's jaw tightened, which means Wilhelm's death wasn't just convenient, it was orchestrated, and those who helped cover it up were paid well. The archivist hovered nervously. Should I log this find? No, Blaze said sharply. Not until we confront Jasper. If he knows we've uncovered this, he'll disappear. He handed the oilcloth-wrapped ledger to Amelia, who secured it in her satchel. They made their way out of the vault in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing heavily on their shoulders. Outside, the fog had thickened, swirling like ghosts around the iron fence that lined the cobblestone street. A carriage waited at the corner, and Blaze hailed it without hesitation. We go to Belford's estate, he said. Tonight. Amelia hesitated. Do you think he'll talk? Blaze's voice was low. Not willingly. But I'm betting he still believes the widow doesn't know the truth. That's our edge. As the carriage rumbled through the mist, Blaze stared out the window, the note still echoing in his thoughts. Do not trust the will. It is not who you think. Who had Wilhelm written it for? And who had betrayed him first? His wife, his partner, or someone else hiding in the shadows, still pulling the strings? The answers waited in the darkness ahead. Chapter 11. A whisper behind the frame. The hour had grown late, and the Lamoureux household had settled into an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the windows like a thick fog. Poirot sat in the drawing-room once again, alone now, save for Hastings, who was pacing like a restless hound, hands stuffed into the pockets of his overcoat. Poirot, ever still, sat in a high-backed chair with the velvet cushion beneath him gently worn with age and secrets. In his lap, a folded linen handkerchief he'd been twirling for several minutes, eyes fixed on the fireplace, but not truly seeing it. Mon ami, Poirot said quietly. Do you recall the painting in the hallway? The one just outside Madame Duvet's room. Hastings stopped mid-stride, brows furrowed. The landscape. Fog over the valley. Exactement, Poirot replied. It has been moved. Slightly, but unmistakably so. Moved? Who on earth would bother someone who had something to hide? Perhaps Poirot cut in softly. Come, we must investigate. Hastings followed as Poirot rose and the two stepped out into the hallway. The painting, a dull and heavy piece, hung with indifference. Poirot's eyes were sharp, alert to millimeters and dust lines that others might miss. He reached forward and with a gentle hand lifted the painting from the wall. Behind it was a narrow slit in the wallpaper, hidden panel, only slightly ajar. Hastings blinked. Well, I'll be Poirot, pressed his fingers against the edge and pushed. A soft click, and the panel swung open, revealing a hollow space behind the wall. Inside, tucked between the wooden beams and wrapped in oilskin, was a bundle of papers. Poirot pulled them out carefully and stepped back into the light. He unwrapped them at the small writing desk nearby, laying them flat. Letters, Poirot whispered, and a key. The letters were addressed to Madame Duvet from a man named Jules. Hastings leaned in, reading over Poirot's shoulder. They were passionate, full of declarations and promises, some dated after her supposed marriage to Lucien, an affair. Hastings murmured. Nan, Poirot said, pointing to the final letter, dated only 2 weeks prior. More than that. This Jules. He speaks of plans, of confrontation, of revenge. Could he have been the man who broke in last month? Possibly, Poirot murmured. But why hide the letters behind a painting? Unless he picked up the small brass key and turned it over in his hand. This is not just any key. It is for a lockbox, perhaps in the study or Lucien's office. We must search. They didn't have to look long. In the back of Lucien's desk drawer, beneath a false bottom, they discovered the small chest mahogany, metal, and with a lock that clicked open with the brass key inside. More letters, but not from Jules. From Emily. Hastings read aloud, stunned. If Lucien discovers we forged the marriage license. Poirot's expression darkened. Forged. Hastings echoed. Ah, Poirot breathed. Then the marriage never truly occurred. Madame Duvet was never legally married. And that, mon ami, changes everything. Hastings sat back, stunned. So she stood to gain nothing from his death. No inheritance, no estate. Exactly, but someone else did. Someone who believed she was the legal wife, or someone who knew the truth and sought to use it. Footsteps interrupted their revelations. Marie, the maid, stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she saw what lay before them. I didn't know you were looking through the desk, she stammered. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And how would you know about the desk, mademoiselle? She froze. I clean it daily, but the false bottom, Hastings added. Marie's lip quivered. Poirot stepped forward, voice calm but iron. You've been listening, watching. You knew about the letters behind the frame. And you moved the painting, did you not? I only wanted to protect her, Marie cried. She was so frightened after he died, she said. Someone was watching the house. I thought maybe those letters were connected. Poirot stared at her, the silence stretching between them. And the key? I didn't know where it fit. I only found it that morning, after Madame fainted. Poirot took a step back, nodding thoughtfully. Then you have only proven one thing, mademoiselle. She looked up, eyes watery. "What's that?" "That more than one person in this house is keeping secrets." And with that, he turned back to the desk. Chapter 12. The Widow's Second Face. The morning after their unsettling dinner with Widow Castell, Detective Blaze sat at the writing desk in the Rosehill Inn's library. Pages of notes scattered like petals from a withered rose. A foggy light trickled in through the tall windows, turning the air into something between silver and shadow. Across from him, Ivy paced, arms crossed, her eyes still fixed on the events of the previous night. "She lied," Ivy said firmly, stopping in her tracks. "About knowing Renata. I saw her flinch when you mentioned the pearls." Blaze nodded slowly. "And did you catch the way she corrected herself when I asked about Dr. Vale? First, she said she hadn't seen him in years. Then she added, except at the funeral, because she had to anchor herself in a believable timeline," Ivy said. "A careless slip. But there's something more," Blaze murmured, tapping a pencil against his notes. "Something about that photograph in the hallway, Dr. Vale and the widower. It's from 1946, but Renata claimed she arrived in Rosehill in 1948, and she was in that photo." "Exactly," Ivy said, eyes narrowing. "She's lying about more than just Renata." A knock came at the door. Mrs. Corwin, the innkeeper, peeking her head inside. "A letter arrived for you, Mr. Blaze. No return address." Blaze took the envelope and offered a polite thank you. Once the door closed, he slid it open with a brass letter opener, typed in neat, impersonal print. "There is more than one widow in Rosehill. Look at the cemetery. Records 1951. Find out who really died." Blaze looked up. "We've been asking the wrong questions. We've assumed the widow's identity is authentic. What if it isn't?" Ivy stared. "You think Renata Castell might be someone else entirely?" Blaze didn't respond immediately. Instead, he grabbed his coat. "Let's walk to the cemetery." Rosehill Cemetery was as quiet as history itself. Rows of cold stones, names weathered and softened by time. Blaze and Ivy moved deliberately, scanning each headstone, searching the 1951 section. "There," Ivy said, pointing. "Lucinda Vale, died January 14th, 1951. Beloved wife." Blaze knelt, examining the engraving. Vale, Dr. Benjamin Vale's wife. Next to it, another marker, Eleanor Castell, 1912 to 1951. 2 women, same year, 1 town. "And here's something strange," Ivy said, pointing to a note etched along the side of Lucinda's marker. "Survived by no children, no immediate family." Blaze rose slowly. "Then who arranged the funeral? Paid for the grave?" They stood in silence until the wind moved through the trees like breath. The Blaze turned sharply. "We're going to the Historical Society. I want death certificates, obituaries, anything public. There's a ghost here, one who stole someone else's story." Back at the Rosehill Historical Archives, the place smelled of pressed books and lemon polish. An elderly archivist, Mr. Fallon, helped them locate 2 newspaper clippings from 1951. The obituary for Eleanor Castell was brief. No mention of husband or children. Claimed she was a seamstress. Lucinda Vale's was longer, noting her marriage to Dr. Benjamin Vale, her community work, and her tragic passing from tuberculosis. But something stood out: her maiden name, Castell. Blaze stared at the paper. "She wasn't just a Vale," he whispered. "She was a Castell. Lucinda Castell became Lucinda Vale, and the widow, calling herself Renata Castell. Now what if she's Lucinda's sister? Or cousin, Ivy said slowly. Or what if she's Lucinda? Blaze's brow furrowed. But Lucinda is buried, is she? Ivy leaned in. What if someone else is in that grave? A chill slipped through the room like an unseen thread of smoke. That evening, they returned to the widow Castell's manor, not to confront, but to observe. From the wooded edge of the property, they watched candlelight flicker in the parlor. She always sits alone, Ivy murmured. No letters, no visitors, no phone calls. She lives in the past. A black cat wandered across the front lawn. Moments later, the widow herself appeared at the window gazing out at the dark trees, her hand resting against the glass. Her reflection looked wrong, not aged by grief, but frozen, trapped. Blaze whispered, "She's not mourning a husband. She's hiding a life." Behind them, dry leaves rustled. A voice, hushed and urgent, came from the darkness. "You're getting close." Blaze turned sharply. Dr. Benjamin Vale stepped out from behind a hedge, face pale as candle wax. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a folded note. "But you didn't get it from me." He disappeared as quickly as he'd come, swallowed by the woods. Blaze opened the note. Inside one line, "She never buried her sister." They stood in silence. Ivy's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then who did she bury?" Blaze folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "We're going to find out. But not tonight." He turned toward the inn. "Tomorrow morning, we will return to the cemetery, and we bring a shovel." Chapter 14. The diary in the chimney. The storm had relented, leaving a sheen of damp silence over the village. Morning light spilled through the drawing-room windows, casting long shadows on the Persian rug as Detective Inspector Felix Vale sat across from Miss Hall, her hands trembling over a chipped porcelain cup. "Tell me again," Felix said gently. "How did you find it?" "The flue was jammed," Miss Hallwell whispered. "I couldn't sleep last night, so I lit a fire in the hearth of the east wing to warm the air. That's when I noticed the draft was off. I fetched a poker, cleared some soutane. It slid out. A leather-bound journal, scorched on the edges." Felix pulled the blackened diary from his coat pocket and placed it on the table like a sacred relic. "And it belonged to your father." "Yes," she said. "His initials are inside the flap." He opened the cover carefully. The ink had blurred in parts, but most of the entries remained legible. The latest one was dated 3 days before his death. "Something has been stolen from the chapel. I can feel it in the walls. Even the dog won't go near the pews. Mary knows more than she admits. The last rites were false." "Chapel." Felix raised an eyebrow. "There's no record of a chapel on the Hallwell estate." Miss Hallwell blinked. "There was one. It's sealed now, under the south gardens. It was abandoned after the fire in 1842. Felix stood, already reaching for his coat. "Then it's time we unseal it." The gardens were still soggy from last night's rain. Miss Hallwell led Felix and the housekeeper, Agnes, across the moss-covered flagstones to a patch of wild roses curling against a crumbling stone wall. "There," she said, "beneath the fountain base. My father said the stones were never properly buried." With a crowbar borrowed from the tool shed, Felix pried at the circular base of the old fountain until the slab gave way with a groan. A stale draught whooshed out. bringing with it the scent of mildew and stone dust. A rusted spiral staircase descended into darkness. Felix lit a lantern. "Agnes, wait here. If we don't come back up in 20 minutes, go directly to Constable Reed." The descent was steep, the air thick with silence and forgotten prayers. The base of the staircase opened into a vaulted chamber with rotting pews, a collapsed altar, and a large brass crucifix lying sideways on the floor. Miss Hallwell knelt by the pews. This must have been where he last came. He wrote about hearing voices in the walls. Felix paced the edge of the room, eyes scanning. His gaze fell upon a peculiar square imprint in the mortar behind the altar, an outline that didn't match the surrounding decay. He tapped it. Hollow dot. He wedged a knife into the seam and pried. The panel clicked, revealing a small alcove containing a glass jar filled with ashen, a silver ring bearing the Hallwell crest. Felix inhaled sharply. "This is a mourning jar." Miss Hallwell stepped closer, eyes wide. "But this crest, that ring was buried with my mother." Felix turned the ring over. "And yet it's here, hidden in a chapel your family pretended never existed." He looked down at the jar, then at Miss Hallwell. Someone retrieved her remains, possibly reburied them, or not. A sudden creak above made them both freeze. Footsteps. Felix raised the lantern. "Stay behind me." They turned the corner toward the staircase, just as a figure in a dark coat slipped through the trapdoor and bolted across the garden. "Go," Felix shouted. They emerged seconds later into the misty morning. The intruder had already vanished down the Hedgerow. Felix caught his breath, eyes fixed on the trees. Someone knew we'd be down there. Someone watched us enter. Miss Hallwell was pale. Then they knew about the jar and the ring. He nodded grimly. And they didn't want us to find them. Later that evening, back in the study, Felix examined the contents of the mourning jar under a magnifying lens. The ash contained traces of parchment, not bones. He shook his head. It didn't remain. It was evidence. Burnt pages. Miss Hallwell leaned in. But why? What were they hiding? Felix didn't answer right away. He turned the ring over once more and set it beside the charred fragments. Then he opened the last page of the diary again, eyes narrowing. "There's something in the way your father phrased this. The last rites were false. He wasn't talking about religion. He meant the will, the inheritance." Miss Hallwell stiffened. "You think someone altered it. I think someone murdered your father. And now we know it wasn't to silence him over ghosts. It was to suppress the truth he was about to reveal." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "And whoever it was is still among us." Chapter 15. The hidden ledger. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of the boarding house as Poirot sat across from Miss Gertrude Ellings, who looked far less composed than their previous meeting. Her teacup trembled slightly as she lifted it to her lips. "I don't see how I could possibly help further," she said, avoiding his gaze. Poirot, ever observant, leaned back with his fingertips pressed together. "On the contrary, mademoiselle, I believe you already have, though not in the way you intended." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The rose petals, the missing candle stub, and most curious of all this ledger I discovered behind a false panel in the hall bureau." Gertrude went pale. Poirot opened the slim, weathered notebook and flipped to a page near the center. Names, payments, appointments, all handwritten, some in code. But the meanings are evident to one who knows what to look for. She looked away, her voice barely audible. You had no right. Nan, I had the responsibility. And you, Gertrude, had the motive. The woman stood up abruptly. That book has nothing to do with the murder. Oh, but it has everything to do with it, he replied calmly. It contains the names of influential clients, some rather scandalous, and your sister's name appears several times. Tell me, was she involved in blackmail? Gertrude hesitated for only a moment. No, she said, too quickly. She wrote those names for protection. She never meant to use them. Poirot tapped the page. Then who did? The silence stretched. At last, Gertrude sighed. Miriam discovered something about one of the boarders. I never knew who. She threatened to reveal it unless they paid her to stay silent. Poirot's voice was gentle, but she grew bold. She demanded more. Gertrude nodded miserably. I told her to stop. She wouldn't listen, and so someone ensured her silence. Just then, Hastings entered the room, holding a piece of waxy parchment. You were right, Poirot. I found this in the fireplace, in room 7. Poirot examined it closely. An envelope. The wax seal partially intact. The same rose emblem that was pressed onto the petal we found in the fire. Gertrude's eyes widened. That's from Lady Hargrave's stationery set. Indeed, Poirot said. A guest with noble connections. Someone who might be utterly ruined if exposed. They descended into a long silence. Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of order, detail, and precision. He now had the motives and the method. What remained was opportunity. He rose to his feet. Mademoiselle, I believe the time has come to speak with all the guests together. This web must now be unspooled. Outside the room, the storm had begun to quiet. But inside the house, tension thickened like the air after lightning. As Poirot and Hastings moved down the hallway toward the drawing room, Poirot muttered softly, It is almost complete, mon ami. The pattern is forming. And the killer? Hastings asked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The killer has already revealed themselves. They simply do not yet realize it. Chapter 16. The Drawing Room Confrontation. The drawing room, though grand in its Edwardian elegance, felt oppressively small as all the guests gathered under Poirot's direction. The fire crackled softly, offering a false sense of comfort. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, blurring the windows with streaks of gray. Lady Hargrave sat upright, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mr. Crispin lounged in the corner with forced nonchalance, his eyes darting between the others. Mrs. Levington sniffed indignantly into a lace handkerchief, while Mr. Barnaby nervously tapped a finger against the arm of his chair. Miss Gertrude Ellings stood apart from the rest, pale and taut as piano wire. Poirot took his place near the fireplace, with Hastings quietly at his side. Notebook in hand, I thank you all for gathering, Poirot began, his tone calm yet laced with quiet authority. The time has come to bring clarity to the shadows that have long danced within these walls. Lady Hargrave lifted her chin. I trust this won't take long. I have appointments in London. Alas, madame, what we discuss here may well delay many appointments. She scowled. Poirot pressed on. Mademoiselle Miriam was not a random victim. She was a woman who discovered something dangerous, and she made the error of thinking she could use that knowledge without consequence. What sort of knowledge? Mr. Crispin asked, arms crossed. Poirot turned to him. Knowledge of secrets. Specifically, the kind that finds its way into a little red ledger hidden behind a false panel. He held it up for all to see. A ledger that contains many names and many sins. There was a sharp intake of breath. Mr. Barnaby looked positively ill. Poirot continued. Miss Miriam, it seems, had taken to recording the indiscretions of her fellow boarders. She had notes on conversations, receipts of payments, and curious symbols of flowers marked beside several entries. One of them matches the petal found in the fire the night she died. Lady Hargrave's voice trembled. If you're insinuating, I insinuate nothing, Poirot said swiftly. I speak only of facts. You used that same rose wax on your personal correspondence, did you not? She faltered. That proves nothing. True. But then we must look at motive. Miss Miriam, it seems, threatened to expose a past scandal, one that could have ruined someone in this very room. Mrs. Levington interjected, her voice sharp. It could have been anyone. She was always meddling, always watching. And someone decided to silence her, Poirot said softly. Silence fell, as heavy as thunderclouds. Poirot resumed pacing. Now consider this on the night of the murder. The candle was burned down to a stub, and a second candlestick was moved to the writing desk. Why? To conceal the timing of her death, or to make it seem as though she died writing a letter. But the real clue, Ms. Amos, is in the wax. He turned, eyes scanning each face. Whoever killed her tried to destroy the letter she was writing. But wax dripped from the candle onto the petals, rose petals, like those on Lady Hargrave's envelopes. Someone tried to create misdirection. Lady Hargrave stood abruptly. I won't listen to this any longer. I have nothing to do with this sordid mess. She stormed from the room. Poirot let her go. Do you think she did it? Hastings whispered. Poirot shook his head slightly. No, mon ami. She is proud, yes, but not cold, and not clever enough to hide the ledger. He turned back to the others. The killer is still among us. Eyes shifted. Tension twisted through the room. It is a matter of timing, of opportunity, and of fear. Someone feared what Miriam knew, what she would reveal. Poirot's voice lowered. And tomorrow I shall reveal who that person is. Gasps echoed through the room. Even Mr. Crispin looked rattled. But for now, Poirot added, I suggest none of you leave. The killer may still be watching, and if cornered, they may lash out again. With that, he turned to Hastings. Come, mon ami, we must prepare for the truth. As they left the drawing room, Poirot's voice was quiet but resolute. The threads are nearly tied. One last stitch, and the tapestry shall be complete. Chapter 17. The unspoken clue. The rain had finally stopped by the time Blaise and Henrietta returned to the Sneeze house. A soft mist hung in the air, shrouding the trees like ghosts reluctant to leave. The wind had calmed, but something in the air still hummed in unease. Neither of them could shake off. Henrietta stepped into the drawing room first. Her eyes scanned the room, as if expecting someone to be waiting for them in the shadows. Blaise, ever cautious, paused at the threshold and flicked on the main light. Everything was still. The fire had died in the hearth. leaving behind a faint trail of smoke curling upward. "Did Mrs. Dilly say anything about going out?" Henrietta asked, her voice hushed. "No," Blaise murmured. "And her coat's still here." They found Mrs. Dilly in the kitchen, her head resting on the table. A teacup toppled beside her. Henrietta let out a small cry and rushed to the old woman. "She's breathing," she said, touching her cheek. Blaise examined the cup and sniffed. "Chloroform, I'd bet my license," he said grimly. Someone didn't want her talking, but what had she been about to say? Once they got Mrs. Dilly settled on the couch and called for a doctor, Blaise turned to the old photo Henrietta had found earlier, the one from 1963, the summer of the fire. Henrietta stood beside him. The photo spread across the table, with the names written on the back in fading ink. "There's something not right here," Blaise said. "This boy Daniel, he's on the left, yes, but look at the initials on the back. D isn't where he's standing. That's someone else entirely." Henrietta frowned. "You think the names were switched on purpose?" "Either that, or someone lied about who was in the photo at all." And if Mrs. Dilly tried to correct that lie, she was silenced. Just then, a rustle sounded from the hallway. Both turned sharply. "Mrs. Dilly," Henrietta called softly. No answer. Blaise stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He opened the hallway door, revealing nothing but a swaying curtain in the breeze. But something had changed. A single object lay on the floor just beyond the Cortina child's toy train. "Wooden, painted red and blue dot," Henrietta gasped. "That wasn't here before." Blaise picked it up, turning it over. Underneath, crudely etched in the wood, was a single word: "Forgive." It didn't belong to any child currently staying in the house. It was old, carved by a desperate hand, most likely years ago. "Someone left this as a message," Blaise said. "Someone who's been hiding more than just their identity." The next morning brought no comfort. Mrs. Dilly had regained consciousness, but remembered nothing after her tea. "Someone knocked," she whispered. "I thought it was the post." Then blackness. Blaise stayed quiet about the train. Instead, he returned to the garden, where he'd first seen the faint outline of the bricked-up well. The earth was soft again after the rain. As he walked, a strange sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He paused by the rose bushes, now wilted from the storm. His foot kicked something hard. Another toy. This time, a small spinning top painted the same red and blue. He knelt and picked it up. Carved underneath, "I'm sorry." Henrietta arrived moments later. Another one. He nodded. "They're leading us somewhere," she said. "To the truth," he replied, piece by piece. Back in the study, Blaise pulled out the archived local newspaper clippings Henrietta had recovered from the library. One article, yellowed and nearly torn in half, was about the summer fire. The fire that had taken the life of a young boy, Joseph Miles. "Look here," Blaise said, pointing to the paragraph. "They say the cause was an accident, candles left burning." But the next article, just 2 days later, suggests something else. A witness mentioned hearing arguing right before the blaze. Henrietta leaned closer. "That's never been mentioned before." Who was the witness? The article just refers to them as an anonymous neighbor. But if that neighbor is still alive, it's Mrs. Dilly, isn't it? Henrietta whispered. Blaise nodded slowly. "She's the only one left who might have seen what really happened, and she's being targeted." The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and jarring. They both stiffened. Blaze rose and moved cautiously toward the door. Through the window, he saw a figure retreating down the front steps. He opened the door and looked around. No one in sight. Just a plain brown envelope on the doormat inside. A single photo. It was the same group from 1963, but this time, someone had circled one of the faces in red ink and drawn an X over another. Henrietta stared. That's not the original photo. No, Blaze said. It's a message. One of these people is the key, and someone else doesn't want them talking. As Henrietta clutched the photo, Blaze stared out into the fog, settling once more over the Sneeze house. Secrets were clawing their way to the surface, and someone was desperate to bury them again. But Blaze wasn't about to let them. Chapter 18. The Widows. Dirty secreta, heavy hush fell over the drawing room as Detective Blaze, now standing by the hearth, slowly turned to face the widow Moreau. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving a damp stillness in its wake, one that seemed to echo the tension filling the room. The widow sat upright, her fingers tightly intertwined in her lap, her veil no longer obscuring the guilt etched in the deep lines around her eyes. Across from her, Camille, pale and silent, stared at the floor. While Inspector Renaud shifted uneasily in his chair, the Blaze began softly. You see, it was never about inheritance, nor about love, betrayal, or revenge. It was about shame, a shame buried so deep it needed a murder to keep it hidden. Madame Moreau blinked slowly, but said nothing. Blaze walked over to the secretary desk and opened the bottom drawer, the one that had been locked since the first night. I had this opened an hour ago. Inside were torn letters, fragments of a confession addressed to Henry, written by you, Madame. Her lips parted slightly, but still she didn't speak. Blaze pulled out a single torn page and read aloud. Henry, I never meant for the child to find out. She believes I am her mother, but I am only her aunt. Her real mother was Claudine, my younger sister. When she died, I raised Camille as my own. Camille lifted her head sharply. Blaze turned to her gently. Yes, your real mother was Claudine Moreau. She died giving birth to you, and Madame took you in, fearing the scandal would destroy the family's name and ruin your future. Camille looked between the detective and the widow, her lips trembling. Why hide it? The widow finally spoke, her voice hollow. Because my sister was a disgrace to our family, an affair with a married man. No name on the birth certificate, I thought. If I gave you my name, my protection, you'd never suffer the way she did. Inspector Renaud cleared his throat. But what does this have to do with Henry's murder? Blaze nodded slowly. Henry discovered the truth. He had found the birth records and the letters. He was going to tell Camille everything, not to hurt her, but to offer her independence, real freedom. She was his goddaughter, after all. Madame Moreau's eyes glistened. He said he would take her away, that I had no right to keep her in this house of shadows. So you killed him, Blaze said flatly. The widow closed her eyes. I poisoned his wine with aconite from the conservatory. It's slow and silent. He died in pain, yes, but never knew it came from my hand. He thought it was his heart again. Camille whispered, you lied to me. My whole life. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Blaze approached her gently. Camille, you are not a mistake. You are not a shadow. You're the survivor of a secret that should have never been buried. The inspector stood and signaled to his men outside. Madame Moreau, you'll come with us now. The widow stood with surprising grace. I regret nothing but the pain it brought her, as she was led away. Camille remained seated, stunned, broken, but also, perhaps, for the first time free outside. The rain had stopped. An early morning light filtered through the trees. Blaise stepped into the cold dawn, coat collar raised. Renaud joined him. You always find the hidden thread, don't you? Blaise lit a cigarette. No secret stays buried forever. Not even in a house of ghosts. They stood in silence for a moment before Blaise looked back toward the manor. A girl just lost her mother twice over, he said, but maybe now she can finally begin. And with that, Blaise walked into the misty morning, the truth behind him, the road ahead, long and quiet.